This is me with my client, Ricky Jackson, the moment he learned that he was going to be set free after serving almost 40 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit. And this is him a couple hours later, walking out into the Cleveland air, age 57, as a free man for the first time since he had just turned 18 years old. Ricky was convicted in 1975 when a white businessman was gunned down in cold blood in Ricky's predominantly black neighborhood in Cleveland. And as you can imagine, a crowd soon gathered, and a 12-year-old boy stepped forward and told the police, "I saw who did this. It was Ricky Jackson and his two friends." The police believed the little boy. They went and arrested Ricky and his two best friends, and they disbelieved Ricky. From that point forward, they were convinced Ricky and his friends committed this murder, and they twisted and spinned every piece of evidence that came forward, like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. In fact, they ended up missing very strong leads that could have led them to the actual perpetrator. Years later, obviously Ricky was freed, but he served many years on death row and actually came within a few weeks of his execution date, when, because of a lucky technicality, he and his two best friends were moved off of death row to life in prison so that they could be alive to see their vindication and exoneration in 2015. In 2003, I co-founded the Ohio Innocence Project right here at UC's College of Law with now Mayor John Cranley and others. And our mission is to work with law students to investigate the cases of Ohio inmates who claim they're innocent. And if we can determine that they're innocent, seek their freedom. And this is 9 of the 24 people that we have now freed through our work. The 24 exonerees in Ohio served 450 years in prison for crimes they didn't commit. And they are part of 2,000 exonerees nationally that have been identified in the past 25 years, wrongfully convicted, served time they didn't commit. And we know that those 2,000 are just the tip of the iceberg, because if you do this work, you see that in every one of these cases, if you look at it closely, it took coincidence after coincidence, miracle after miracle, for you to actually spring an innocent person. In most of the cases we investigate, we end up at dead ends. The witnesses have died, or the DNA to be tested has been lost by the police. I actually came to this innocence work by accident. I was for many years a prosecutor in New York City. And here I am getting an award at the time from Attorney General Janet Reno. On the far left is Eric Holder, who later became the Attorney General under Obama. And after I left the prosecutor's office, I wanted to be a law professor, and my first job was at a different law school. And they had an innocence project there, but the professor who ran it was on sabbatical the first year. So they asked me to supervise it since I had this criminal investigation background. But I was extremely skeptical and had this prosecutor's mentality. I didn't think innocent people were convicted in this country. And I can remember one of the first meetings I sat in with the students. They were talking about this guy they were investigating, and they were convinced he's innocent, and they just visited him in prison. And I sat there thinking, what a load of BS. This guy's totally guilty. But DNA testing went forward. His DNA didn't match the DNA from the crime scene, and he was released. And so that was a totally shocking experience for me. It began opening my eyes to problems in the system. And so from that point forward now, this has been 15 or 16 years, I've spent my life working on wrongful convictions, and I've learned a couple things. One is that we convict innocent people in this country far more than we would ever recognize. And second, that this is caused by simple human failings, psychological limitations that cause investigations to go astray. In fact, the criminal justice system is still operating based on the understandings of the human mind from the 1950s. I'm going to talk about 3 different things, 3 different psychological phenomena that lead to wrongful convictions: confirmation bias, malleable memories, and lie detection deficits. And the first is confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is a problem that all of us suffer from. All human beings tend to go into a situation and interpret all the evidence and all the facts that come toward them in a way to confirm their pre-existing beliefs or what they hope the outcome to be. So if you're looking at a field of stars or a field of evidence where everything's pointing to no, if you want the answer to be yes, and you have an agenda to find the answer to be yes, you're going to be able to patch together a constellation to find that answer. And this exists not just in the criminal justice system, but of course in everyday life. This is the debate between Gore and Bush in the 2000 presidential election. And after the debate, they did surveys of people, and they said, which candidate appeared more presidential, more honest, and answered the questions with more concrete ways he was going to solve the nation's problems. And of course, Democrats overwhelmingly said, oh, Gore was much more honest. He gave concrete answers, and Bush just gave, sort of jargon. He was more presidential. Republicans overwhelmingly said the exact opposite. Bush was more presidential, gave more honest answers. Because that's the human tendency to go into a situation and we see what we want to see. We latch onto and we register in our mind those pieces of evidence that confirm it while we discount everything else. So how does this play out in the criminal justice system? Well, criminal investigations are awash in confirmation bias because we're not recognizing advances in recent psychology. But I'm going to just point out one area where you can see this, and that's in the forensic sciences. Of those 2,000 people who have been identified as wrongfully convicted, about 40% of them were convicted based on wrong forensic science testimony. I'm talking about the CSI people you see on TV. Somebody at their original trial said, hey, this guy's fingerprint was at the crime scene, or it was this defendant whose foot tread was in the mud next to the dead body. But later they were proven innocent, so the forensic scientists gave incorrect testimony. So we started studying, or social scientists started studying, how could this happen? And we realized that confirmation bias plays a big role. Before we turn to that, though, I'm going to have you do a real quick experiment. I want you to take about 10 seconds to read that paragraph and tell me how many F's you see. Okay, how many see one F? How many see 2, 3, 4, 5, 6? Okay, nobody saw 6. There are 6 F's there. And about 75% of you said there are 3 F's. Okay, there are 3 F's in substantial words. The other 3 are in the word of. So if you count the word of, there are 6 F's in that paragraph. So why did you miss those words? Because you're expert readers, and your mind has created shortcuts to get you to the result you need, which is quick, comprehensive reading. So how does that play into the forensic sciences? This is a fingerprint, and a fingerprint expert's job is to take, on the left, that's the fingerprint found at the crime scene on the bloody knife. And on the right is the fingerprint of the suspect the police have identified, and they've taken him to the police station and rolled his finger in ink, and there you go. And the job of a fingerprint expert is to say, is this the same? A psychologist named Itiel Jor started looking at these wrongful convictions and saying, why do we have all this bad testimony in these forensic cases? And he wondered if confirmation bias could play a result. So what he did was, he went to leading fingerprint experts around the world, and he said, I need you to do something for me. I've got fingerprints from a case where an expert years ago testified that there was a match. But later, DNA testing proved the person innocent, so we know the fingerprint expert made a mistake. Can you look at this fingerprint and point out the differences between the two and show me where the fingerprint expert made a mistake 20 years ago? But what each of those fingerprint experts didn't know was Itiel Jor had gone and pulled from the court files one of the fingerprints that each expert had testified to was a match years before. Now, fingerprint experts just look at fingerprints all day long, so they don't remember the one they looked at the day before. And so he had these experts look at them, not knowing they were looking at one. They called a match and convicted somebody based on that testimony before, and he got 80% of them to flip their answer and say, oh yeah, this is not a match. This fingerprint expert messed up. There's a discrepancy here, 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 here. And what this shows is that how you precondition experts taints the outcome. And we're still doing this in the criminal justice system. When I was a prosecutor, I did this all the time. I would call up forensic experts. I'd say, hey, man, my trial's starting on Monday. I know the bullet came from this guy's gun. I need that report. Let's go. The other thing I want to talk about, the next, is malleable memory. And most people think of human memory as sort of a flash drive or a database that we're taking down everything we see, and later when it comes time to testify in court, you hit the play button and you just play it back. Now, everybody recognizes that sometimes we forget things, but most people think that what they remember accurately. In reality, though, we now know that human memory is more like Wikipedia. It's constantly changing. We can edit our own memories. We do it all the time. And other people edit our memories through suggestion And the scary thing is, when someone edits our memories through suggestion, we're not even aware of it. So this comes up in a variety of forms in the criminal justice system that leads to errant outcomes. This is the lineup where a woman who was raped had to identify the guy who raped her. And she had described the perpetrator after the attack as sort of stocky with a wide face. And you'll see that only the guy on the far right matches that description. The rest of them are kind of skinny. But she picked Jerome White in the middle and said, I'm positive that was the rapist. Jerome White served about 20 years in prison, and DNA testing later came back and proved that he was innocent, and the guy on the far right was the true perpetrator. So how did she get her memory flipped up? Well, the day before she came in and looked at these 5 individuals, she went down to the police station, and the police officers showed her a few photos of people they thought were good suspects. And the only one of these 5 men that were in that group of photos was Jerome White in the middle. So the next day when she came in and she looked at these 5 individuals, she immediately jumped out and recognized Jerome White. It had been suggested to her the day before it might be the perpetrator, and it caused her memory to get mixed up so much that she identified him as the perpetrator and couldn't even see the real rapist who was standing right in front of her. And this happens all the time. If you watch Making a Murderer, you saw that Penny Bernstein did the same thing. After police suggestion that it might have been Stephen Avery who raped her, she identified Stephen Avery. And later, when DNA testing proved it was someone else, she said on Dateline NBC, even today, when I look at the guy who I know raped me, I still see Stephen Avery's face. It also comes up in false confessions, and in about a third of the cases of the people who've been exonerated, they confess to a crime they didn't commit. And I know everybody sitting here would say, I would never in a million years confess to a murder I didn't commit or a rape I didn't commit. But when you study this issue, you would be surprised how often it happens. After hours and hours of police interrogation, where they're telling you did it and suggesting you might have blacked out or you're suppressing the memory, and through their questioning, you can learn facts about the case and you start to picture it in your mind. And then here's a dirty little secret. Most people don't know that police officers are allowed to lie to suspects in the interrogation room. So they do these things where they come in and they go, oh, just got a call from the lab. Your DNA is at the crime scene, buddy. Oh, we just got your fingerprint. And many people, through time, begin to question their own memory and then get confused on the images they're seeing, whether that's real memory or that's what was put there by the police questioning. And if you think it wouldn't happen to you, look at a recent study that just came out of Canada where they employed real interrogation techniques on students, college students, and got 70% of them to confess to committing a serious felony before college. And in these studies where they implant these memories on people, it's often the case that after they tell the subjects, that didn't really happen, you were involved in an experiment, they still believe it did, and they call up their family and they say, is it true that I really didn't commit that armed robbery? The third thing I want to talk about is lie deception deficits. Most people in this country believe that human beings can listen to another person and watch another person telling their story and determine with accuracy whether they're telling the truth or not. And police officers believe this even more because they've been trained on this psychology since the 1950s that they're perfect lie detectors. In fact, in one of our cases, David Ayers, who spent 11 years in prison for a murder he didn't commit, later when he sued the state, the detective who arrested him was on the stand, and she was being questioned about why she began focusing on David Ayers, and she said, because I can tell immediately when somebody's telling the truth or not from all my experience, and I could tell that he was lying from the first second I started interviewing him. And that led her to latch onto him as a suspect, and the investigation went astray. We now know through advances in psychology, however, that this is not true at all. In fact, human beings are about 54% accurate at telling when somebody else is telling the truth or not, barely better than a coin flip. They do these studies, for example, where they'll take nursing students and they'll say to the nursing students, lying is an important part of your job because there's many situations where you've got to keep painting a rosy picture to the patient until the doctor determines it's the right time to tell them the bad news. And so we're going to test how well you can lie, and you're going to be graded on it. And they divide the nursing students into 2 groups. The first group watches a video of a pleasant ocean scene, and then they're videotaped talking about what they just saw and answering questions about it. The second group is shown a bloody, gory, disgusting video, but they're told to lie and say they saw a field with, flowers and puppies running around and things like that, and they're videotaped answering questions about what they saw. And then human subjects watch the 2 groups and have to determine which group of nursing students is lying, and they're about 54% accurate. This is over more than 200 studies with more than 20,000 human subjects. Police officers go through the same type of testing, and they're barely better than regular citizens, still in the 50s in terms of accuracy. And they perform these with videos of interrogations where suspects we now know are lying because of the evidence that came out later, like DNA testing, and interrogations where we know the person was telling the truth. And police officers are also barely better than a coin flip at telling the truth. So all of this and many other things together lead to tunnel vision, where something early on in the investigation happens, the detective believes that this person's lying to me, so they become dead set on they know what happened in this case, and they have their theory. Or a forensic analyst makes an error, or there's a false confession. And then through the rest of the investigation, it becomes a matter of trying to fit everything into their theory while ignoring all other evidence that contradicts it. My client, Clarence Elkins, like all of these individuals, was a victim of tunnel vision. He was convicted of murdering his mother-in-law, and the only witness was a child, the granddaughter of his mother-in-law, who was spending the night at her grandmother's house that night, and she saw the perpetrator for a few seconds in the dark. And as soon as the police arrived there after it happened, she said, "It looked like my Uncle Clarence." And with some questioning from the police after a few hours, it started to become, "It is my Uncle Clarence." And then they went out and arrested Clarence, went on television and patted themselves on the back for solving the crime. From that point on, every piece of evidence that surfaced during the investigation pointed to Elkins' innocence, but they completely ignored it. This included alibi testimony. You had people saying he was 45 minutes away from the crime scene. They're lying. And they told the jury they were lying. And forensic evidence, which suggested Clarence was innocent. They explained it away. Our team at the Innocence Project, working with others, were able to do DNA testing that not only proved Clarence innocent, but identified someone who had just been released from prison, who was a sex offender, living 2 doors down from the crime scene as the true perpetrator, and he's now serving life in prison. The police department that were investigating this murder were investigating that guy, Earl Mann, at the very same time. But they had tunnel vision, they settled on Clarence so quickly that they did not see Earl Mann. And what's even worse is it came out later, during the civil suit, that before Clarence's trial, Earl Mann had been picked up for another crime and had confessed to killing Clarence's mother-in-law. But the police were so dead set in their theory that they sort of discounted that as the ramblings of a derelict. I've just scratched the surface here, but I have a book coming out in September that talks about all these psychological problems. And it makes the point that we're still living in the 1950s in our criminal investigation, and there are very simple things we can do to reduce human error in the process, but we're not doing them. I want to leave you with one final point. This is not just the criminal justice system where all this psychological stuff comes into play. I mean, the next time you're in an argument with a family member or your roommate, and you're saying, "Hey, somebody lost the remote control. Somebody walked off with it. Where is it?" And your roommate says, "You're the last one that was watching TV." And you say, "Nuh-uh, you were watching TV last night." And you start arguing back and forth. These same psychological phenomena are kicking in, and sometimes it's better to just step back and search for the remote control. Thank you.